It's time for a little technical.
Wrangling.
We have to do the technical thing.
And just let me know when to advance the slide and I'll do it. for you.
Okay. So hold this till it turns green.
Think so.
Turns green. 1, 2, 3.
Sounds good. Can you hear it?
Good.
All right, excellent.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me. I think this is, oh, I have to stand probably in one
No, you're
place.
good.
Can I wander?
You can wander like 3-4 feet in the other direction. It's a wide
3
angle. You're
or
good.
4 feet in either direction. Okay, that might not be enough. I have to be able to see.
Yeah, this is the camera that's being used, so it's a
Right.
nice wide angle, so you've got some room.
I have to be able to see what's up there.
Oh, we can, yeah.
No, that's good. So thank you very much for having me. I'm Joan Walsh. I work at Mass Audubon. I'm the Bertrand Chair of Ornithology. I've got an even longer title than that we don't have time for this evening. I've been working with Common and Roseate Terns since 1980 on Great Gull Island in Long Island Sound. I've been working with birds since 1980 when I started working with birds at Great Gull Island in 1980 in Long Island Sound. In between doing that and doing what I do now, I've worked on wood storks, I've worked on seabirds on the Farallon Islands. I worked at Cape May Bird Observatory as the director of research, and then I went into early retirement. Then I came out of early retirement to work at Mass Audubon. I think this is my third talk for Hampshire Bird Club. Well, we did the Breeding Bird Atlas. Doesn't anybody remember that? And then thank you all for all of that. Those data are online. They're really great. And our State of the Birds for, I think, our second State of the Birds. I came and talked to you as well. So we can advance the slide. So Common and Roseate Terns are conservation dependent species. Common tern on the left, roseate tern on the right. When we talk about a species being conservation dependent, it means what we do, what us humans do, is the thing that keeps these critters on the planet. Common tern would probably persist on the planet. It's got a very wide range. If we stopped doing all the support that we have, it is unlikely that it would continue breeding in the states of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New York without the sort of support that we give it. Roseate tern, mostly from humans, plain old disturbing birds during the breeding season. Right, we've already shrunk down where seabirds get to breed in the East Coast of the United States. Roseate tern, the situation is definitely more dire. There are only 3 colonies with 200 pairs or more in the northeast coast of the United States, and they are defended very strongly. And without that defense, we would not have them as a breeding bird. So when we talk about these species being conservation dependent, we have to think about everything that we do when we interact with them on the colony, right? And as time has gone on, it's become more and more, the imperative has been more clear to us that we can't just protect them on the breeding grounds, that we have to protect them through their entire life cycle. So that's something that has been over the last 20 years that a lot of conservation ecologists have spent their time thinking about. If I spend a lot of time on Great Gull Island saving every little baby roseate tern just to have them get lost down in Brazil, is that really worth the effort? Or should I be working in Brazil, for instance? So we can go to the next slide. There are many people to thank for this. The work that has been going on in the Northwest Atlantic population of roseate terns has been going on for more than 50 years at Great Gull Island. And it's been going on across the hemisphere. It's been amazing. The work that I do is a tiny fraction of the work that has been done. This is Helen Hayes. who deserves the Presidential Medal of Freedom for the work that she did restoring the common and roseate terns to Great Gull Island. Great Gull Island is owned by the American Museum of Natural History. And right now I have to start the timer on my watch or we are going to be in deep trouble. Helen worked at Great Gull Island for more than 50 years. The work that I do now at Great Gull Island and beyond, my partners are Yukon and URI, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the country of Canada, the country of Brazil, Southern Brazil, Mass Wildlife's work that is going on Bertrand Island is second to none for roseate tern conservation in the world. We can be so proud of the work that they've done there. And Josh, if you haven't had Carolyn come and talk about the bird and ram restoration, the Bird Island restoration, I'm going to give you a little snippet of it later. Y'all feel good when you pay your taxes because she has done an incredible job out there. Without these partnerships, and these partnerships continue to grow, without these partnerships, we would not have to keep these birds on the planet.
To me.
So the enigmatic roseate tern, most of my photographs, if you look at them and go, that's a, yeah, thank you for it. If you look at a photograph and you say, oh, that's a really nice photograph, it's not mine. It's either Peter Payton's from URI, or it's Matthew Mail, who's someone who's worked for 49 years at Great Gull Island. This is one of Matthew's. If you look at it and go, that's a really lousy photo. There you go. You found me. Roseate tern, an enigmatic creature, and you're going to see that when I show you the range map of this animal. Very tough. There are just not many animals with a range map like roseate tern. Roseate tern throughout its worldwide range has some very different, yet they all kind of group together. People keep trying to tear their genetics apart to find different sets of roseate terns, maybe even different species. And they really can't get there, even though these birds nest in very different habitats and they have really different ranges. They just can't, this bird still continues to stay roseate tern, a couple of subspecies, but they're not even very strong. And most of what we're going to be talking about today is going to be roseate tern, but next slide. Most of what we'll be talking about is roseate tern, but every now and again, I will drift into common tern. There are no roseate tern colonies in the Northwest Atlantic that aren't conspecific with common terns. And typically common terns, there's a whole lot of them. And the roseates kind of sneak in and use the common terns sort of as cover. So we're going to talk a little bit about what full life cycle conservation is, and then how that fits in with roseate terns, and the sort of where and when you find roseate terns, what their status is. And we're going to be talking about the wintering and breeding threats and actions that we're involved with. We don't have time to talk about staging and migration, which is really unfortunate because that's the work that is really underdone in the East Coast of the United States and especially in Massachusetts. Most of the roseate terns in the Northwest Atlantic bring their young to Cape Cod to learn how to feed at the end of the breeding season, and we don't know much about that. Upwards of 70% of all of the East Coast population of roseate terns, the babies come to Cape Cod and learn how to feed. And we also don't know much about their migration. They don't take tags well. Don Lyons at National Audubon and Keenan Yakala at National Audubon think they have a tag attachment now where we might get some good information about migration for them, but the only stuff that we have that's any good is from geolocators, which is really very sloppy. We can't get the precision that we really need out of that. But I hope in 3 years we'll have more information about staging to be able to fill this picture in more, because Massachusetts is critically important for these animals for that. But we'll be focusing on wintering and breeding. Next slide. So when we talk about full life cycle conservation, we're really talking about the where and the when of a bird and its conservation needs. This is a map of bobolink throughout its annual cycle. And if you want to work on bobolinks and you work real hard, like we're doing at Mass Audubon, to try and get farmers to have delayed mowing practices, right, through the bobolink project. You work real hard on that, but you're not doing any work down in Bolivia to work on the large scale take that goes on down there. You're really just spitting into the wind. You have to be able to protect the birds at both ends and during migration if it's a species for which you have a conservation responsibility. You need to understand what the costs are throughout their entire annual cycle, or you're going to end up spending money maybe in the wrong place or at the wrong time of year. And I don't know if you know this, but there is not a lot of extra money to spend on conservation. Right? We have to be very smart about it. And sometimes it's hard to walk away and say, while there is a take here, the more important thing for us to work on is somewhere else. That can be a very difficult thing to do. But that's why it's important to be able to form partnerships and work throughout the range of birds that are imperiled or near imperiled. Next slide, please. Will the good people online say if there's a problem?
Yeah, they will, and they have not. I think everything's good.
That's good. Isn't that nice? I want you to commit this graph to memory, and we'll get back to this later. There'll be a quiz later. On the left is southern petrel, and on the right is snowy petrel. Here's what you get out of this. Seabirds in general, as time goes on, as you go along that right hand axis, as time goes on, some seabirds after a while, 10 years or 15 years, will reach their peak reproduction. And then they'll senesce some and it'll come back down. For other seabirds, it's just awesome until they die. Their reproductive success is really great. One of the things that we learned from this, and this fits into full life cycle conservation, especially relative to the work in Brazil I'm going to talk to you about, is that adults in seabirds are worth a lot. They are more valuable than young. When I'm protecting young on Great Gull Island, I have to protect about 30 or 40 of them to equal one bird that has completed one migration, one adult bird. So when I'm losing birds in Brazil, I'm losing a whole lot of babies, right? If you think about the conversion, and I hate talking about it this way, but it's real. This is true because again, there's not extra money. We would like to protect every baby and we would like to protect every adult. But the math tells us that if we are limited with how much money we have to go after where the reproductively valuable birds are. Next slide. So this gets a little more cheery because he's wearing a jaunty little crown. So the idea with our conservation of roseate tern, I think I forgot to tell you at the beginning, roseate tern are federally endangered. The Northwest Atlantic population is federally endangered. It's our only federally endangered breeding bird in Massachusetts. We have an outsized responsibility for roseate terns in Massachusetts. Mass Audubon feels that, and that responsibility is the reason that bird's on our logo. You know, a little triangle? That big long tail, that's a roseate tern. So the challenge that we have is to find out where are the birds throughout their annual cycle. When are they there? What are the threats when they're there? And how do those threats affect the population? Sometimes things look awful and they really don't affect birds. Sometimes things don't look that bad and they have a cumulative effect that adds up, and it's problematic. And then how we spend most of our time is thinking about how to avoid these threats. Are there things that we could do to avoid the threats, minimize the threats, or if we can't do that, to mitigate for those? So the first thing we got to know is where they are. So this is from Birds of the World, and it's the cookie map of roseate tern. The thing that I learned just last year is that roseate tern basically does not occur in the Eastern Pacific. There's a big clump around Australia, there's an Indian Ocean group, and then there's a North Atlantic Basin group. And the North Atlantic Basin group gets up into the cold water. There's a big colony on Rockabill outside of Ireland, and there's a big colony in Long Island Sound, and there's a big colony in Buzzards Bay. We have a cold water set of roseate terns. Otherwise, they're a tropical critter. It's hot where they are. But this kooky little group comes up into the North Atlantic, and that's the group that we're going to be talking about. So I flipped my talk today because I never get enough time to really talk about Brazil. I always spend all my time talking about breeding birds, and we'll get to that. But the Brazil work is the new work and the most interesting work. So the wintering range of the birds that are breeding in the Northwest Atlantic, the U.S. endangered population, they winter. We don't know much about their transit during migration. We know that there's a fair amount that light up in the fall in the Caribbean, and then they come down onto the north coast of Brazil, where it's blue, on the north coast of South America, and they wrap around the nose of Brazil down to Bahia, and they don't go south of there. Common terns do go further south all the way to Argentina. They have roughly the same wintering range. So we're going to be talking about that north coast of Brazil. And so we know where they go, and we know something about when they're there as we start to assess the threats for these birds down in Brazil. But there's a real lack of data for being able to have clarity about the where and when. The when, not so bad. The where, we have a lot of questions about. Where are they spending time on the north coast of Brazil, and how long are they resident? We don't have really good data about that yet. And when we look at what the threat landscape is there, for the most part, most people would have said about 5 years ago that the biggest threats were probably hunting on the north coast of South America, or possibly oiling. And we have found something really that's quite different from that. And we're just being unable to learn now how we might mitigate those threats. Oiling is certainly an issue. Collisions we're finding not with on-land turbines, there are tens of thousands of near-shore on land, but very close to the ocean turbines on the north coast of Brazil. They're small and they're close together. These are some in the town of Galenos, where our work is going on. But we're going to be talking about collisions, but not with turbines. We're going to be talking about collisions with power line wires that are unrelated to the turbines even. They don't even carry the turbine electricity. Just put a pin in that idea. There's a small trapping threat that really hasn't been well understood. And of course, the cross-cutting issue through all of our birds, when we talk about long-distance migrants, is the challenge of climate change. The climate is not changing for people or wildlife in one place. It is changing throughout the range. So that's a cross-cutting issue for them. These are some very recent pictures that were taken of terns roosting on oil platforms off the coast of Brazil. The coast of Brazil has an incredible amount of oil development. And my partners down in Brazil were just funded to go out and look at tern use of these platforms. The use is basically all winter long, and it helps us to understand some of what exposure to oil might be, which again can be a sub-lethal effect on these birds. It doesn't necessarily have to be an oiling event that kills them, but they can ingest a fair amount of oil by just preening small amounts off their feathers all winter long. And there are thousands and thousands of platforms off of the coast of Brazil. And we're just beginning to understand this. Now, when we fast forward to us having hundreds or more than 1,000 platforms of wind turbines of offshore wind development off of the east coast of the United States, we have never calculated in the attractiveness of the platforms for terns. Terns are trained on this half of the year. We haven't calculated that in with an increased collision risk. This is just emerging right now, the documentation of how strong their use is of platforms. So we're gonna roll back in time to just before the pandemic, about a year before the pandemic. The phone rings. That nice lady, Helen Hayes, at the very beginning of this talk, picks up a phone. It's a friend of hers in Brazil, says, I hear about a lot of dead terns in northern Brazil. Can you come and have a look? She says, can't do that, but Mass Audubon has someone who can. And John Atwood and myself went down to Brazil to investigate this loss of roseate terns. We went down because my position allows me some flexibility for looking into bird conservation issues, especially international bird conservation issues, for which Mass Audubon may be able to be a connector to solve a problem. And we knew from the bands that were on the birds that some of them had been banded at Bird and Ram Island in Massachusetts. This was a really direct connection for us. These are the names of my partners in Brazil. There are a lot of people in Brazil, and sometimes I think they all work on this project. So we're talking about the north coast of Brazil, started about 9 o'clock here, the map that's at about 9 o'clock, and you'll see one of the states is lit up yellow. That's Rio Grande do Norte, and if anyone speaks Portuguese, I apologize for what I just said, because it didn't say it well. That's Rio Grande do Norte, and then it's, if you go up to about the 11 o'clock, you can see it blown up a little bit, and there's a little red area there. We're zooming in there. We're getting to the village of Galenos. And then if you go to the 12 o'clock, you can see the section of beach that we work on. And then it gets zoomed in a little bit further at the 3 o'clock, and you can see the power lines that we're looking at. And then there's a Google Earth image of the power lines and the beach. Along this, I'll leave this up for just a minute. Along this stretch of beach, so with all the offshore oil development, Brazil was funding a not-for-profit to do beach surveys on about 600 kilometers of beach on the north coast of Brazil, looking for oiled marine mammals and birds, but right at the high tide line. Over time, the monitors started to notice, even though they were down on the high tide line, they started to notice that higher up, they were seeing some dead birds. They work at a rehab facility, and so they started to pick up these dead birds. And they brought these dead birds in, they froze them, and then they started to try and figure out what kind of birds they were. And they found out that they were roseate terns. And that's what triggered the phone call, because roseates are also endangered in Brazil as well as in the United States. So we have beach monitors who, it's not their job to pick up birds higher up on the beach, but they get interested in it and they do it. And they follow the same protocols, and they do that for a couple of years. And it's only because of those beach monitors that we know that this happened. These guys going way above and beyond the call of what their actual job was. So over time, these guys, they're really good at collecting data, and they saved all the birds and they reported the bands. And over time, they started to find out that larger numbers of roseate terns were colliding. Now, remember I said some birds are more important than others? If a roseate tern has made it from the northeastern part of the United States, completed even one migration down to Brazil, it's already gone through a huge hump. That bird is worth a lot more than one chick on a colony. And some of the birds that were found colliding with the wires, because so many of the roseates are banded in the Northwest Atlantic population, one of the birds was 17 years old. That bird had completed 14 migrations. Most of the birds were not banded. We think some of them are Caribbean birds. And there is a different genetic signature of the Caribbean birds. And someone's looking at that right now to see how we can apportion the dead birds to the Caribbean population or the Northwest Atlantic population. But you can see that in a year, in 2017, when we have 70 dead roseates, 70 dead adult roseates on this one beach. It's the largest known kill that we have of adult roseate terns in the Northwest Atlantic population. So why were these birds dying? They were dying because along this beach are these power lines. They're fairly tall. That's John Atwood. He's about 6 feet tall. They're fairly tall power lines, and they carry power from the town of Galenos to the town of Little Galenos, literally. That kind of sprung up about 15 years ago. And it's people living on the beach. The area has a fishing culture. It's got a really kind of great vacation culture, windsurfing culture. A lot of people come in for windsurfing on the weekends. So lovely, small, fairly quiet town. And there's probably 250 people that live in the town. But then on the weekends, it swells up because people come out to the beach for the weekend. And the birds during the winter, roseate terns are out in the water feeding during the day. They're at the equator. It's dark at 6 at night. And when they're coming back in to roost, it's dark. And they're hitting the power distribution lines along the beach. And when they hit the lines, they get blunt force trauma and they get wing amputations or head injuries. Most of the birds who are hit do not survive. We did a test to find out if our monitors were actually finding all the birds that hit. We went and hid birds out there when the monitors went through and they found them all. So we think our numbers are pretty good. We don't think we have much scavenging. We think we have pretty good data on the number of birds and how well people were finding them, the monitors. So from January 2010 to March 2020, you can see this is a heat map. All of those red dots are where dead birds were found. And you can see that there's sort of areas where there's sort of stronger levels of kill than in some of the other areas. It's pretty well distributed. But our challenge was to, what do you do about this? This is more than a kilometer of beach that you've got birds colliding with. So you call your friends and you say, what do I do about birds colliding with wires? And it turns out there is a giant body of literature and lots of people who are working on this. And your friends say, you need to talk to Powerline Sentry. They create these markers that during the day absorb sunlight and at night reflect it back. And so you can make the lines visible to the birds. All you have to do is buy more than 1,000 of these and then get someone in a bucket truck to drive down a beach in Brazil and install them all. So that turned out to be easier than anybody thought. We found out we can order the lines. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service funded us to order the markers. We ordered the markers got sent down there, and the good people at not immigration, when you're importing stuff, what would that be called? The tax man.
Custom.
Yeah, customs in Brazil said, no, you have to pay, you have to pay us a lot of money to bring these in. So we lost a bunch of money there because they taxed us like crazy on these. Then somebody came and picked them up, and then the great guys from Neo Energia who own the lines spent literally 3 weeks driving down the beach. First, they tried it by hand in 30-mile-an-hour winds with this install post, and then that didn't work. So they got a bucket truck, and then it took them about 3 weeks to install them all. And then you have to wait. This was done summer, winter. It's kind of all the same there. It's when it was done when the birds aren't there. We always have a difficult time with summer and winter when we're having our conversations. So then we had to wait. And oh, sorry, there's the installation. There's the installation piece. It was yeah, so it's right after on the same one. The installation piece, and then we doubled then to the next one, we doubled the number of monitors that we had. We got them out of the high tide line. We got more monitors. We brought them up higher to do the monitoring to see how many birds were hitting these wires. And lo and behold, in 2022, because in 2021 there was the pandemic, blah, blah, blah. Everybody's going to have these blocks on their graphs forever, where nothing happened. We ended up with 14 dead birds. Now, we didn't reduce the kill to 0. This year we have 17. The 14 from 2022 all hit in one night on a very high wind night. This year, the kills were spread out over about 3 days, but it was still fairly clustered. So we haven't reduced it to 0. Next slide. We haven't reduced the kill to 0, but we brought it way down. And we worked with Manuela Huso at USGS, who knows a tremendous amount about how you estimate the number of things that hit something based on the number of things you find. And we did some elaborate scheming with her. And one of her schemes was she wanted the lines marked a certain way one year, heavy marking in some places one year and lighter, a number marking another year. And then she wanted them reversed. So we just finished the reverse year. And NeoEnergia went out and did that for us. They went out and moved the lines. They've been great partners at trying to reduce this. Like I said, it's not at zero, but we're moving there. We will not get it to zero. We won't get it to zero. But what our real challenge is what the next thing is that we do, which is we have to find out where there are other lines on beaches on the north coast of Brazil, because we may be killing hundreds and hundreds of roseate and common terns as well as local species if there are other places. The best way to do that is to do a GIS analysis and to get GIS data on where there are other lines, and in particular where there are rivers that are coming out. There's sort of a delta right behind Galenos, and there's also salt works and shrimp works right behind the beach that we think are attracting the birds. So we're trying to get funded to do that GIS work and then ground truth it and see if we have other places or if this is a unique kill area. If we do find it, we will mark the new lines or find ways to deconflict, whether it's varying lines or moving lines. We're going to keep at this. So now we're going to move up north. And I apologize for this map. I can't find a better one that shows what the Northwest Atlantic population looked like over the last 50 years. All these little black dots are all extirpated roseate tern colonies. They're no longer there. The big red and yellow down at the end of Long Island Sound and in Buzzards Bay, those are where your three large colonies are at Great Gull Island, Bird Island, Ram Island. And then CV Island, that colony is actually growing quite a bit up off the coast of New Hampshire. So next slide. So we transit here because we're talking about the breeding birds. We move here to, we need to have a little bit of a better understanding about common tern and roseate tern. Roseate on the left, the slick little black bill, common tern, chunkier, a little bit bigger. Roseate's federally endangered. About 90% of the endangered population nests in Long Island Sound and in Buzzards Bay. That's 90%. And more than half of those are in Massachusetts. Roseates typically like to nest with a little bit of a roof over their head, whether it's in a rocky cavity or in purpose-built boxes, or a lot of grass. They don't really like to see the sky. It seems maybe they love to see the sky and they just like it to be a surprise. I'm not sure. They have fewer eggs on average than common terns, so you would expect them to sort of their population to grow a little more slowly. 1 to 2 eggs. They winter in Brazil. Our data from Great Gull Island shows really fairly steady reproduction and sort of, there's some dips here and there. The same for both of them. Once roseate's breeding, once they return to breed the first time, they can live for 5 to 20 years. It's very unusual to find a bird over 20, but they'll generally get several years of reproduction. Common tern is a state listed in New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. We have some of the largest colonies in the world in this neck of the woods. Monomoy is up to almost 15,000 birds. No one can really explain how that has happened. It was 10,000 a couple of years ago. Typically, when common terns come in to nest, they like it quite open, but once they have chicks, the chicks need vegetation to shade them from both the sun and from predators. It is unusual to find a common tern nesting under, say, a rock like you find roseate terns. This figures importantly later. They winter down to Brazil and around the corner to Argentina, some even a little bit north. On Great Gull Island, 3 of the last 5 years have been horrible reproduction, the worst reproduction in the 50 years that they have been keeping track of that colony. And we don't know why. Some of it is food, We have an unexplained early chick death that we're working with pathologists to try and figure out what it might be, if it's disease or if it's something else. And again, fairly long-lived birds. Back to roseates and their propensity for houses. These are roseate tern houses, a couple of different styles. They kind of like anything. We have a project going on out there I'll tell you a little bit more about, to test to see if we could really build them the perfect Frank Lloyd Wright house. I don't know if it's going to turn out that way. That's what these guys in the top right are 4 styles that we're going to be testing this year. But you'll note that this set along the left-hand side, just right at the edge of the island, they like to come right in. At Great Gull Island, they do not nest in the middle of the colony like at Bird and Ram. And they also nest in some terraces, this sort of stadium seating that we have. So when we look at breeding status in the Northwest Atlantic populations, like I said, there's these unexplained dips. We don't know what they are. Right now, they're on a little bit of a rocket ship up. There was almost 5,400 pairs in 2022. The species population to be recovered is 6,000 pairs, getting close to that. But we're supposed to have multiple colonies of over 200, and we will never reach that goal. So recovery for this species, all the eggs are in a couple of baskets. Right? And in those baskets, a tremendous amount of oil moves by every day. Long Island Sound and Buzzards Bay. That's where they are. So this is where I have done most of my work, is on Long Island, in Long Island Sound of Great Gull Island, right off of New London. It's about 17 acres. It's at the mouth of Long Island Sound. And one of the things that's really amazing about it is most of the water from Long Island Sound that comes out on an outgoing tide goes by this island. And there is a tidal rip there. That is amazing. It's 5 knots and up for those of you who sail. It is something that is really stunning to watch. Small fish can get disoriented in that kind of setting. If anybody does sport fishing, the race is on one side of Gull Island and the Plum Island Sluiceway is on the other. If any of you are sport fishers, you are immediately thinking of stripers and you're thinking of bluefish and you're going, that's where I want to go. Well, those guys are down there and they're driving up bait fish, and bait fish are made of more available in these really turbulent waters that are around Great Gull Island. But Great Gull Island has always been the wonderland that it is right now. Starting in about 1900, the U.S. Army kicked out 7,000 pairs of common terns, decided that we needed to make Long Island Sound safe, and covered every inch of the island with human-made forts. We're going to go through a couple of incredible slides here. This is the Army fort when they were just about ready to move out in 48. The next one is the eastern end of the island, one of the 2 firings of a 16-inch gun. 16-inch gun means the shell you put into it is 16 inches across. It is not, there were only a few of them made. One was installed on Great Gull Island. And here it is. It was only fired 2 or 3 times. Someone took a photograph of it. And then the next one is an aerial of Great Gull Island right after the Army moved out in 1948, when the American Museum of Natural History won a bid to establish the tern colony, reestablish the tern colony on Great Gull Island. This is what the island looks like now, Google Earth. With most of, so the gun is up at about, up in the top right, the 16-inch gun emplacement hole. That's to the east. The next slide shows you who lives there now. These are GPS locations of the common and roseate tern nests. They cover virtually the entire island. The concrete that was left behind, the soil that used to be around the barracks, they're in the rocky crevices, the riprap around the island, the roseate terns. They cover almost everything. Where you don't see them is where there is some elevation and slope. Otherwise, in my little cabin, there literally is a tern that nests on where I step out every morning. I have to step over the nest to get out of my little cabin. This restoration has been wildly successful from the 1970s onward. There's about 10,000 nests on Great Gull Island now. Those gaps in data are just those data have not been digitized yet. They're still analog data. So those summaries, there is data for all of that. Was that my 5 minutes left for 40 minutes? We're going to get there. So common tern, wildly successful restoration there. Again, thanks to thousands of volunteers and Helen Hayes leading the trail. Next is roseate tern. Roseate, you know, they're at about 20% there of the common terns. There's about there's 1,800. Don't take that last dip very seriously over the last few years. Between the pandemic and a change in the number of people that we can have out on the island, we had to change. We're not able to have as many people because where we were having people sleep was filled with asbestos. So we can't have people in there anymore. So our roseate checking has had to slow down. We used to have more people and they were able to have a better handle on it. We're not missing 200 birds. It's just we only do a full island check one day a year, and it used to be done every day. So they were able to find some extra stuff. Wildly successful restoration. So throughout the breeding range in the Northwest Atlantic, what do we find are the real challenges that we have? Well, there's few locations, as I pointed out earlier. There's only 3 colonies that are hosting the bulk of the population, with one other that's coming up, but we'll probably never get above 500. There's vegetation issues which we can control, and this is important to control for common and roseate. Invasive vegetation can keep birds from getting to their nests, and it also can entangle young and adults and kill them. And we do a fair amount of herbicide work out there every year. We also have to understand, as climate change affects sea level, what is going to happen to the birds nesting low in the rocks? We're going to have to get those birds up higher onto the island, which is going to mean either more rocks on the island or better nest boxes, which is why we're doing the nest box experiment that we are. And biosecurity is a real challenge. As we enter, I've been on the phone for the last 3 days talking about nothing but HPAI and biosecurity around that. Biosecurity around rats getting out onto this island, it would be devastating. Biosecurity about getting mink out here, devastating, would be devastating. We'd be able to recover once we trapped everything, but that could take a very long time to get everything trapped. You really have a lot of challenges with getting mammals out onto seabird colonies. And then there's disease. I talked to you about the common tern, the unexplained common tern chick death. And then we have the emerging, is it a threat? We're not sure yet, the unknown of offshore wind development. So when we look at those threats, so how do we rank those threats, and then what actions do we take? We just finished a 4-day workshop. It was about 30 hours of work with 20 seabird experts from the East Coast and West Coast of the United States to help us rank our priority actions for what we're going to be doing at Gull Island as we try and understand what's going on out there and what we're going to do about some of the emerging threats. The first thing that people that is pointed out is that we really don't have great productivity information. We have good census information. How many nests do you have? But how successful are the birds? How successful are they? And it's pretty difficult to be able to do, because remember I said some of the birds are down in these rocky caverns all around the edge of the nest. This year, we're just going to do for the first time, we're going to try and get productivity on them. We use these cool plastic field readable bands. That's a roseate tern chick there on the right. And then you can zoom in. This is WJ4 and that yellow band that's on him. And what we can do is get him marked WJ4 when he hatches. And then we can follow him when he emerges to fledge. And it's going to be the first time that we're going to have data on actual fledging rates for roseate terns at Gull Island. Last year, we did it for the birds, the easy ones in the houses. This year, we're going to do it for the hard ones in the rocks. Peter Payton is leading that up. And when we do that, at the same time, we're doing provisioning work. So we're going to be able to understand about feeding rates and food types, and then who's making the most babies and what years we do that. And it sounds easy, it's not easy. Vegetation, this is common tern. That common tern on the left is living an entirely different life than the common tern on the right. The common tern on the right, good luck to him. He's going to have a hard time getting his parents, getting food from his parents. And the one on the left might even be a little too open. When food comes into that bird, we call them the interlopers, the youngsters who don't really have a nest, they're kind of teenagers. The adults, the mom and dad are out getting food, and the teenagers are like, oh, well, when mom and dad come back with the food, I'm just going to steal it from the chick. So, and that seems to be more common in these very open areas. So we have to find the right balance between, as we do our herbicide work, for being able to still have good cover for the chicks, but not too much cover as time goes on. Next slide. And then we're doing this year, Jess Espinoza, a PhD student from UConn, is doing this. This looks like like an alphabet of runes, doesn't it? Sort of like this should be a game. You know, pick where's your roseate. We should actually do that. They're all numbered. It could be like gambling. Where will the first roseate tern come in? Place your bets now. So there's 4 different box types, and we're going to see if any of them are preferred or if any of them make babies better than other ones. Because as I said, as sea level rises, we're going to have more boxes and more artificial nesting sites for them. So next is provisioning. We do work because, you know, you can't get out of your nest unless you eat. And every year they seem to be eating. There's different feeding rates. There's different food that comes in. As Long Island Sound continues to warm through the winter, Long Island Sound is staying so warm now that lots of the southern fish that used to just come up in August are now persisting through the winter and are breeding early in the spring in Long Island Sound. The fish community in Long Island Sound is changing really quickly. Roseate tern like to eat sand eels, amidites, and amidites are very susceptible to how warm the water is in the winter because they like to eat this big fat plankton. And the plankton comes in 2 versions: a cold water plankton that's really fat, and then the amidites get really fat, and a warm water plankton, which is a skinny one, and the amidites don't get so fat. These are all climate signals, shifts in the community, and shifts in the health of some of the preferred food. We have some challenges with erosion on the island. Picture the island in 1949 and in 2021. And you can see, particularly on the top side is north, you can see the areas in the yellow circle where we've lost quite a lot of beach. And there are 2 areas towards your left where the Army Corps of Engineers removed some old gas tanks, and we now have some erosion that's significant there, as well as at the west end, which is to your far left. I'm glad that that didn't start talking, which it was gonna. We have reason to believe that if we invest in this island, continue to invest in this island, it's the highest above sea level of any of the common or roseate tern colonies in the Northwest Atlantic. We have reason to believe that we can do great restoration there, and that's from the work that Mass Wildlife has done at Bird Island. Is there a graph? Maybe you have to hit it again. Anyway, over on the right there, I don't know why, when we transferred it to Mac, they got a great response. They increased the number of birds that were nesting on Bird Island by 1,000 pairs. Right? Remember, there's only about 5,000 pairs nesting. They increased it by about 1,000 by their restoration at Bird Island. And when we look at Great Gull Island, this is some work that was done by someone at UConn, looking at what we can expect from sea level rise. All those green dots, which I hope are there, are the roseate tern nests. They're all hovering between 2 meters and 3 meters of sea level rise. So when we start looking at end of the century numbers in Long Island Sound, like 5 feet or more of sea level rise, that's probably very conservative. 2 meters is not at all out of the question. We've got a lot of roseate terns to move up on this island. We got a lot to move up. And then we have our good old friend offshore wind. Oops, I spend about a third of my time on offshore wind. This is the Equinor lease. And the Equinor lease is going to be developed and has sold its power to New York. The power is going into Queens with the longest cable that has ever been made to deliver power. And the area where it goes into the mouth of Long Island Sound is less than 1 mile away from Great Gull Island, where they have to bury the cable. The Amidites that the roseates love to eat are sand dwelling. They love to put cables in sand. So we have some unanswered questions about the short-term and medium-term effects of cable laying near Great Gull Island as these cables go by. There is another great place to hook up, right? With offshore wind, we have a lot of challenges with where to plug in. We can make power out in the ocean, but we have to be able to plug it into our grid. And when we go to plug it into our grid, there has to be an existing place there to plug it into. Millstone Power Plant is going to be the next site, which is just 7 miles away from Great Gull Island. So we can expect, Long Island Sound is not pristine. If you ever look at a benthic map of Long Island Sound, it is not pristine. There's a tremendous amount of disturbance that has already occurred there. So these are some of the things that we're looking at to try and understand how we can protect this bird at both ends of its breeding range, as well as the 2 things that I didn't have time to get to, which is the staging area and migration. And I really hope that in the next 5 years, someone is standing here saying, Joan got those projects funded, and this is what we learned about that. But this is what we know so far and what we're working on so far. So happy to do questions, and sorry I went a little bit over. It's only the birds' lives.
I don't think anybody noticed you going. If you could talk for another half an hour or so before anybody started getting concerned. So, all right. So I've got the microphone here. Anyone who's got a question, put your hand up, and I will run around and deliver it. And we have one up already. So, and anyone on Zoom posted it. Greg, are you able to see the chat?
I am able to see the chat. So if there are questions in the chat, either I or Derek can handle them.
Okay, great.
I'm a Long Island.
Where are you from?
Job, actually.
Oh, great job.
Yes. But I think I'm fishing in those areas that you mentioned earlier. Plum Island, is that any interest? Is there any bird nest there?
Yeah, so Plum Island is you saw where Gull Island was, that North Fork of Long Island, right? Our neighbor just to the west, if I was looking towards New York City, there's a pretty big island there, 70 acres? No, bigger than that. Maybe probably it's got to be more than, it's got to be a couple 100 acres. And right now it's Department of Homeland Security. It was USDA. Now it's Department of Homeland Security, and they have level 3 or whatever the highest containment is for disease that you can have. They have there. That lab is being moved to Manhattan, Kansas, because after 9/11, it was thought, why are we studying these incredibly virulent diseases about 75 miles from New York City, because it's such a great target? So it's going to be moved to Manhattan, Kansas, which is going to be an opportunity, when is the last time that a 200-acre island was available for wildlife on the coast of the northeastern United States? Fish and wildlife is going to be tough for fish and wildlife to take it. It's been zoned by the town that it can't be developed. There's a certain ex-president who really wanted a golf course on it. What is most likely going to occur is going to be a 10-year dance around how do we clean up Plum Island? How do we keep research there because it's got a lot of jobs? Stony Brook will probably get a research facility there. And then how do we do biosecurity there to get rid of the rats, get rid of the raccoons, and be able to bring good functioning tern colonies? Because if we can't get the rats and raccoons and skunks off of it, there's no reason. Piping plover nests there now. Common tern and roseate tern do not. But it's going to be a great opportunity. Yeah. There's a scary book written about it too. There's a, yeah.
I didn't hear what you said. Where is this island you're talking about?
Oh, okay. Can we go back to that, Matt? Oh, no, you already closed it. So if you are on the coast of Connecticut and you're looking south towards Long Island and say you're in New London, like you're going to take the ferry over there. So it's about 7 miles off of there. It's in between Fisher's Island and Orient Point. It's part of New York. You'd think it's part of Connecticut, but it's not. So it's at the entrance to Long Island Sound. If you were going to go from Block Island and come into Long Island Sound, you'd go right by it.
See, I can share it with the folks online, but
My question was, could you make artificial islands? We have them for the common terminal island. A little over here. Holding.
Yeah. Yeah, so they've done some work with terns on barges in California. And I've talked to several people about that concept, especially for Bird and Ram Island, the ones in Buzzards Bay, which are only about 3 feet above mean high water. And Bird Island just had a big restoration. Ram Island is scheduled for a restoration. Ram Island, they think, overwashed this winter. So artificial, those may have to get replaced with something like barges. Because there's a limit. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And float them higher as climate change rates.
I think they'll do it themselves. I think, they just float. Yeah. Yeah. It is something that has to be looked at. Big colonies are better than small colonies. Big colonies can defend themselves better. Right now at Great Gull Island, we've got 3 bald eagles. They've started nesting on Fisher's Island, and we've got there's a peregrine going bananas out there right now, eating like peregrines do. You need big colonies because you want peregrines. That's what they eat. Yeah, that system is working. That works. That we can feed peregrines. Right, and it used to be horrifying when that happened. Now it's, there's dead birds but
we have a lot of peregrines here.
Yeah, it's a system that's working right now. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned the 2 other large colonies in the world, in Australia and somewhere else. Are those also threatened?
Oh, so there's a big colony in Ireland called Rockabill. I don't know much about the South Pacific group, about where their big colonies are. In Europe, the big colony is Rockabill, which is just north of Dublin, offshore. And that's about the same size as Great Gull Island. It's got a couple of thousand pairs nesting on it. But in Europe, there are only, that is the only colony over 200, Coquette Island. had about 200 last year. And they had a tremendous HPAI outbreak last year and lost a lot of their roseate terns. There's enough to rebound, but that's about all in Europe. The Azores has sprinklings. I don't know what the total population is of the Azores, but they're all around in the Azores.
You mentioned that you manage vegetation with herbicides. That surprised me a little bit. Is it too big an island to manage by hand cultivation?
Yeah, it's 17 acres. We have a budget of $50,000 a year that we raise in gifts through the museum. We have a grant right now from North American Wetlands Conservation Act for about $50,000 a year for marine debris removal and herbicide work. Mass Audubon donates about $80,000 a year of in-kind time. UConn does the same and URI does the same. There is no budget for hand pulling. We would not be able, and the other challenge is that we have to spray, we do herbicides with pre-emergence. We have to keep it open. What we really need is 3 feet of sand on that island, right? Just to put a cap, because when the Army was there, they brought in actual soil. They brought in dirt, so stuff grows now, right? Whereas if it was the natural soils, natural sand, it wouldn't grow. So we're on the list. We're a for beneficial dredge. When we do a restoration out there, we are a beneficial dredge deposition site for clean sand. So hopefully we'll be able to cut back on herbicide. But herbicide is, it is a war. It's because the birds bring fish in, they poop. There's 35,000 birds. They fertilize everything. And then the ones who die, they're just fertilizer too. And black swallowwort. Has anybody tried to control black swallowwort? And it's down in the rocks where the roseates nest. That we do handle. We have to, because that emerges when the birds are there. And so we have to do the herbicide. Obviously, you don't herbicide when the birds are there. And we also do take samples every year. We take 10 or 20 young every year that die, and we test them for every herbicide. And we've never found a trace of the herbicide in the birds. Nobody likes doing it. Yeah, nobody likes doing it.
Kind of a related topic to that. You mentioned rats, and you had a speaker to the club, I forget how many months ago, talking about colonial seabirds and who had worked using these anticoagulant rodenticides to get mammals off and allow the birds to survive. And I know there's a lot of talk now of Massachusetts legally restricting use of those. So do those get used, or are the rats? Have you kept the rats at bay?
No, we don't have rats. No, we have meadow voles, and they have outcompeted the house mice. The house mice are gone, which house mice can turn into, only if you've got a strong stomach, learn about Marion Island. Just trigger alert, absolutely. There. So the microtus, regular meadow voles, have outcompete in the winter. They competed the house mice. So our house mice are gone. Rats and mink they would be devastating. They'd have to come out on our regular weekly boat. But it happens. I mean, it has happened places. It would be very unlikely. And in those series of workshops, we need to get funded to write a biosecurity plan. How are we going to do surveillance for them? As soon as we go out there in April, we should be having traps that bait stations where we can find out if anybody has moved in, because people can come in October too. you know, when nobody's there. Stuff like that, you know, the vigilance, the surveillance that you have to do at a place like this is really, it's extremely time consuming. Because there's nowhere for them to go. All the other places are gone. You know, we have to be, it is artificial. What we maintain there, conservation dependent species. If we don't do this, they have no place.
Anywhere?
Come on, one cheery question after that.
Anything on the Zoom, Greg? Is all quiet there?
They're all watching basketball.
I have, the playoffs one.
Yes.
Sorry, I kind of stopped watching the Celtics. Or sports in general. Anyway, I have one more question. Oh, yeah. Oh, David.
You know, with your question.
No, I'm saving my.
Celtics are down.
I'm the vice president.
They're losing.
They're gonna do great.
John, it's not a question. I feel totally honored to have had to come out here to talk to us. The amount of information that you presented and the fact that the incredible amount of work that you and so many other people are doing, I just feel totally honored and very moved. So thank you
Thank you.
for the work and for the talk.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, and Mass Audubon appreciate. They let me do this. You know, it's great. It's great, and URI and UConn and the museum are committed to this work. It's a place that gets into you and doesn't let you go. Anybody who's ever been out there wants to be back there. It's when it's in full swing. It's a crazy scene. It's the wildest thing between Maine and Florida when that place is in full swing. 35,000 birds. It's crazy.
Okay, I can't resist asking. The island is called Great Gull Island, but we haven't heard about gulls at all.
Yeah, they're discouraged with extreme prejudice. We wave our arms at them. We really, they nest next door. And when we get out there early enough, we walk the island. They know that the more you walk an island, the more human presence there is, the more monitoring there is at islands, the fewer gull predations there are. So we have some planned walks that happen sometimes just to be present, especially early in the season, to keep them from getting started nesting. Because boy, they really quickly go from, I'm gonna eat your baby, to, oh my God, look, there's a human, we should all be scared. And you know, it's really like not very honest. It is very dishonest what they do to the terns. I'm your friend now. Then they probably, coming from next door, great blackbacks, a couple of bad actors in the blackback world. They can take, you know, 8 chicks a day. Oof. Yeah. Yeah, one who figures it out. Tender little morsels. Uh-oh, I went there again.
Sorry, I had to ask. Okay, unless there's any other last second thing to jump in, let's thank, oh, what? Oh, still a problem.
We walk the island to make sure the gulls don't nest on the island. And the gulls that come in and at the end of the year and steal and eat the youngsters, they get away with it. You know, but again, in a functioning colony, you should be able to absorb predation.
All the gulls around here are gone now because we have no more gulls.
Yes, and hallelujah for that, right? Sorry, Dave.
Only do the terns mind if you're walking back and forth, or do they?
No, they hate us. They hit us, they poop on us, yeah, we are the worst possible things.
But they don't fling the poop in your face like the bona fides.
No, not yet, but I'm not letting them know that happens. Not giving them ideas. Thank you all so much, and thanks for all that you do. Very comfortable.